Well, welcome everybody again from the Hermitage. We wanted to take a moment to share with you guys some thoughts and some resources that we use when we're trying to research the presidency and the presidents of the United States. And the reason I bring this up is because many of you may not be doing a topic that's related to the presidency at all, right? It may not be specifically dealing with a president may not be your subject for your presentation. So why would you want to do this? Your topic isn't even about a president. First of all, when we're thinking about the way people remember history and the way people sort of in their own minds kind of track what happened, when it happened, what was so important about what happened, we often do it by president. Think about the presidents that you've known in the past, so the presidents that have been alive perhaps during your lifetime. And you might think about something that happened, or you may hear your parents, your grandparents talk about things that happened, and they often relate it back to the presidency. So imagine how many times, if I said Civil War, Abraham Lincoln probably pops in your head pretty quickly. If I said the New Deal or World War II, Franklin Roosevelt is going to pop into your head pretty quickly. Going to the moon, the space race, you're going to think of John F. Kennedy. So the presidency, these 4-year terms or these 8-year terms become sort of easy ways for us to categorize events in American history. Presidents are extremely well documented. Even William Henry Harrison, 30 days in office, and we even have archives for William Henry Harrison. So what is happening during the president's term in office is being extremely well documented, and it forms an archive that's a very unique look at events in American history. But finally, I want to suggest to you that when you're looking at any sort of issue from the perspective of the US president, what you're really seeing in his actions are a reflection of the feelings and the ambitions of the nation. So for example, think about the Erie Canal. I know we've got an Erie Canal project in with us today. When you think about the Erie Canal, what do you know about it? You know that this was an extremely complex project that was meant to help unite rivers with other parts of the country, that would help our economy grow, that would help goods and services transfer across the growing frontier. Well, who was president when the Erie Canal went into effect? It's John Quincy Adams. Well, what do you know about John Quincy Adams? Where would his perspective matter on that project? And so what we come to learn is that the growth of infrastructure within the country, the ability to get goods and people transported from place to place, a way to keep a sound infrastructure of communication and connection between communities all over the United States was one of the driving goals of Adams's presidency. So it's a great way to look at kind of a unique look at events that are happening in American history. All right, so where would I even find primary sources about the presidencies? You've been given a lot of really excellent suggestions by our friends at MTSU this morning about how to access the Library of Congress, a variety of repositories that are available to you around the world. I want to add just a couple of extra sources to that, or a couple of extra ways you can get a hold of resources. First of all, I encourage you to think about your presidential libraries, museums, and historic sites, just like the Hermitage. Every president, all 45 of them, not Donald Trump yet, he's only been president for a little while, but our previous 44 presidents, each one of them has some sort of library, museum, historic site, or official archive at a university, perhaps. Every single one of them do. Even William Henry Harrison. So they are available to you. One of the objects that we were just looking at with the Library of Congress, we're looking at those documents that are written by Andrew Jackson. And I'm here to tell you, as difficult as they look to read on the Library of Congress website, looking at them in real life, frankly, doesn't make the job any easier. So we have had curators, we have had historians over time that have taken the time to really pull those documents apart, to really try to produce a quality transcription so that you don't have to do battle with Andrew Jackson's incredibly complex handwriting. Okay, we've done that for you. The majority of presidential sites that you could contact, James K. Polk's home is in Columbia. Of course, we're in Nashville. Andrew Johnson's home is in Greenville up in East Tennessee. Each of us have staffs with historians, with curators, with educators, where we have gone in to do some of that hard work for you. And just like if you were to go into any library, it is our job, it is our goal to put that information into your hands, okay? So when you're looking at presidential history, always try to identify where their papers are, who's the organization that's sort of their official storyteller, if that makes sense to you. And I know that here at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, one of our goals is to be that voice of expertise on Andrew Jackson in a way that the Library of Congress cannot be, or the National Archives, or the White House Historical Association. We want to be that voice for Andrew Jackson. So we've put in the hard work of trying to transcribe and understand these documents, and we are eager to share that with you. So do not hesitate to reach out to presidential museums, libraries, and historic sites. Just a couple of practical tips when you're thinking about presidential libraries. We're very familiar with those now, but a couple of things to keep in mind is there are no official presidential libraries for any president before Herbert Hoover. And he was president in the 1920s and 30s, right before Franklin Roosevelt and at the beginning of the Great Depression. The National Archives and Records Administration decided to start with Herbert Hoover as their presidential library system. So everybody since, from Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, everybody forward, they all have an official presidential library that is sponsored and overseen by the National Archives. But if you're looking for a president who predates Herbert Hoover, Andrew Jackson, for example, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, whoever you're looking for, you're going to need to branch out beyond the idea of a presidential library and actually take a look at what museums and historic sites exist. But that's also where our national repositories come in to help. As Ms. Duke showed you, you can see the vast majority of Andrew Jackson's papers on the Library of Congress website. We just saw that. There are some papers of Andrew Jackson's at the National Archives. There are some at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, which is where the Andrew Jackson Papers Project is run out of. And the University of Virginia has been working hard to create a searchable database of the papers of our first 7 presidents, what they're calling the Founding Documents series. And then finally, go to your public, your school libraries, all resources that you're already familiar with. But what I want to encourage you to do is to talk to the professionals that are working at those facilities. Some of you have done that very well. I've had a chance to see some projects where you've gone to interview, perhaps your public librarian or your school librarian, and that's excellent. So keep up that good work. But they can help in a lot of unexpected ways. So don't hesitate to reach out to them and ask for some unique help for sure. All right, so that's where you're going to find your primary sources, but what about secondary sources when it comes to understanding the US presidency? If you've ever tried to do a project on George Washington, then you've seen the number of sources that exist on George Washington. We're talking about thousands of publications. In fact, if you go to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois, or if you go to Mount Vernon to see George Washington's estate, you're actually going to see in both of those places a collection of every book that has been written about those men. At Lincoln, it actually fills up like a whole column within a sort of a lobby, and it's as high as a flight of stairs. So they've just piled one copy after another. George Washington is the same way. So where do you begin breaking down the multiplicity of sources? You've already been given some great tips too, but the first thing you want to read for is accuracy. some basic details are usually very checkable, right? George Washington is born in 1732. If all of a sudden you end up with a source that's trying to tell you it was 1734, you might not trust anything else that's coming in that source. So make sure you're paying attention for some of those accurate details, and they are checkable. You also want to make sure that you're reading for bias. And that's a word that we hear a lot in the media. We're hearing it, you're learning about it at school. And what does bias mean when you're trying to come to understanding, when you're trying to synthesize a whole bunch of data that you're pulling together? A couple of tips that I like to use when I'm reading for bias is, one, I like to do a very quick check on who the author is. Most publications will either provide a brief bio of the author or the sources that they're using. You can go online and you can find the same content as well. So if you have somebody, for example, John Meacham wrote an excellent biography on Jackson called American Lion. If you go in and you look at John Meacham's credentials, what qualifies him to write a book about Andrew Jackson and to write it well, you'd find out that he was a lawyer. He's a native Tennessean. He's a journalist, that he has connections amongst presidential historians. He has connections at these national repositories. And so this is an author whose work you can trust because his connections, his education, his training, his professional experience shows that he is a person of excellent thought. And so that's a way to understand it too. When you encounter bias in your secondary sources, though, it doesn't mean that the entire source is not useful. What it can provide you is a new way of looking at that president. It can provide you with a new way of looking at that particular historic event, perhaps. And so that's all stuff that you want to consider when you're forming your topic and working on your conclusions. And again, this is a point where I highly recommend reach back out to your presidential sites in order to have this conversation. Check some of these past them and see what they have to say it. And then finally, synthesizing all your sources. It's a tough job. You guys typically do a great job, and I've seen some really great projects this year where you all are synthesizing your material very well. And so I'm very proud of you for that. But again, it's a judgment call when you're trying to synthesize. It depends on how well you've done your research, depends on how well you trust your sources, and how well everything fits together. So that's a big job, and we are always here to help guide you in that process when it's needed. All right, so like I said, where can I find some help? Definitely reach out and contact staff members at presidential libraries and museums. The starting place that I would recommend when you're looking at a presidential site that you might want to contact, or any museum that you might want to contact, you might want to start by reaching out to their education department, just like mine. So on a site, on a museum's website, often there's a link for education or K-12 education. And under that, they usually differentiate resources for students versus resources for teachers, just like some of the websites we've just seen. But the educators are the ones who are specifically trained and eager and ready to work with you one-on-one. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't put you in touch with curators, historians, administrators, other staff within museums whose perspective and whose work is going to be a big asset to you. So reach out to those educators first, and chances are pretty good that we're all going to be working pretty hard to get you connected to the best resource that we can. Finding some help, again, looking at the authors of the secondary sources you're using, and then take a look within your community itself. I reviewed a project last year that went on to the national contest, where the students were talking about an advancement in civil rights when it came to searches and seizures, and interpreting the Constitution to understand searches and seizures and sort of the rights of law enforcement versus rights of citizens. And instead of just sticking with like government websites with research and primary sources that helped inform their topic, they actually went and interviewed people within their community. They interviewed their local police chief. They interviewed a local lawyer. They interviewed somebody who had been incarcerated at a local jail and had some conversation with them. So they had really sought to get resources from within their community. Okay, so do that. Where does this go back to presidential history, though? I don't want you to think we've lost sight of that. When you go into your communities, oftentimes, let's say you're discussing the Civil War. That's a great topic. Let's say you find somebody in your community that does living history, or they have researched Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps they have collections, objects that they've collected over time about the Civil War. Here's a question you might ask them. How do you think Abraham Lincoln's decisions are affecting the people whose work you're covering, right? Does that make sense? So what does the role of the president look like to the people who are living out any president's policies, procedures, ambitions, goals? What does that look like lived out in the lives of people in your community? Okay. Now, that's going to be someone's opinion, but it may give you another way to research. It may clue you into sort of another avenue that exists for you to be able to study on. Okay. Do I have any tried and true resources? Yes. National Archives and Records Administration, the Library of Congress. My colleagues from MTSU just gave you a lot of great advice on how to manipulate those sites and how to maneuver them, how to navigate them. And so follow their clues. They have given you some excellent, excellent advice. I was just thinking, I wish I'd had some of that advice when I was a student and trying to navigate even how to get started with large research topics. So they gave you some great stuff. Two other places I want to make sure to point out to you. One is the Miller Center for Presidential History at the University of Virginia. These presentations are going to be in the video, so you'll see where those links take you. I'm going to open that up though, and you're seeing the Miller Center here. Now, a couple of things you're going to notice right off about the Miller Center's website is it looks like it has absolutely nothing in it for students your age, okay? I'm going to propose to you that that is incorrect. What the Miller Center is trying to do is provide a way for citizens, not just K-12 students, but all citizens, a way to understand the impact of presidential actions and decisions, the impact of presidential words. And so it's going to go from George Washington all the way to Donald Trump. So it even deals with current events. It deals with the current implications of past decisions. So for example, if you're talking about a president who adds an amendment to the Constitution, during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, 1801, we have the 12th Amendment added to the Constitution that describes how the presidential election is to be conducted when we don't have a clear winner from the popular vote or the Electoral College vote. That is very applicable to the Bush-Gore election of 2000, right? So if you're doing a voting rights project, you might want to take a look at that. If in a few years you get around to doing a project on the Bush-Gore election of 2000, this is going to be a great resource for you to make those connections between the 12th Amendment of 1801 and the election of the year 2000. They're also going to divide it into lots of issue and policy sections where you have thought leaders in the field of politics, economy, law, history, that are coming together to discuss the impacts of these various presidential decisions. It's going to go into U.S. domestic policy. How does a president's decision impact citizens? Foreign policy. How does a president's actions represent the nation to the world? What do we look like in the eyes of the world, and how is the president responsible for helping to guide that? So just wanted to introduce that to you from the Miller Center, which is housed at the University of Virginia. Oops.
Hey Aaron, real quick, somebody is in the waiting room trying to come in.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. Give me a second and let me get them in. All right, looks like we've got everybody in. Okay, another site I want to point you towards is the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And for any of the teachers and the mentors who are with us, you are also going to be very familiar with this site as well. They do a lot of summer teacher institutes all over the nation, connected to all sorts of topics, not strictly presidential necessarily, but there are many in there as well. So there are some excellent resources here for you. There is a collection that is searchable. They have specific K-12 resources that you're going to want to take a look at. I particularly like this Bringing Documents to Life video because, again, it's about how paper and policy is lived out in people's lives. And when you think about the role of the President of the United States, and this is where Andrew Jackson stands out so strongly, is that the president's job is to answer to the citizens. Andrew Jackson put forward the idea in a very powerful way that the president is the only elected official that we all have in common. Now, we are all in Tennessee, which means we all have the same senators, but we certainly don't have the same congressmen. We don't have the same local officials. We have the same governor. But the president is the only person that we all have in common. And so studying presidential decisions and presidential thoughts and ideas gives us a very powerful way of understanding what the president thinks about the people of the United States and how various activities going on in our lives are influenced and what his response, or one day her response, should be to them. So I want to make sure you've got a good look at that. You're going to find some great stuff in there as well. All right, so a few last insider tips for you. Oh, I think I gave myself away. I think I got ahead of myself already. Herbert Hoover is the first president to have an official presidential library through the National Archives. But presidential documents for presidents previous to him can be found in many places. So don't be limited just by what the Library of Congress is showing you, or what the National Archives is only showing you, or what the Hermitage might only have to show with you. You need to be ready to get out there and make sure that you're looking in several different places. Another insider tip, take a look at jobs that the president held before or after his administration. What that's going to help you understand is more insight into the way that particular person views American society, what their contributions to American society should be. Pay attention to who those major decision makers are around each president. Jackson, for example, had two vice presidents. One goes on to be president, and that's Martin Van Buren. But he also has another vice president that turns out to be one of his greatest enemies, and that's John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. If you are doing research, for example, on the nullification crisis of 1832 and 33, which is the first time in which a state threatens to secede from the United States, John C. Calhoun is going to come up in your studies. But by extension, Andrew Jackson should come up in your study as well. So be looking at the people around the presidents and around these major decision makers. And I think that's going to open up some avenues. And then finally, always view the actions of the president from at least two angles. Look at it from the president's point of view. We do a lot of teaching at the Hermitage on Indian removal. That is a subject that that's very important for us to tell. And you can imagine why. I'm sure you're familiar with Andrew Jackson's role and responsibility when it comes to Indian removal. If you just looked at Andrew Jackson's perspective on Indian removal, you're going to come away thinking that Indian removal was a good idea, that it was the right idea for our country, that Jackson's goals for Indian removal were the right idea. But that's if you only stick with Jackson's views. So make sure you're finding some opposing views in that. Conversely, if you were looking at, say, Principal Chief John Ross of Cherokee Nation, and you're looking at his reaction to Indian removal, what the fate of the Cherokee people are, how Ross is going to go about organizing their removal, what the people need during the removal, how he's going to advocate for them, you need to understand what he is up against. And what he is up against is Andrew Jackson. So you need to make sure that you're getting both of those perspectives in there. I think I skipped over a resource real quick that I want to make sure we cover. Because presidents are the executive leaders of the United States, they have a lot of dealings with foreign nations, okay? If you are working on a presidential topic, what I encourage you to do too is reach out to some of those foreign museums and libraries. You can do it through their websites. I want to show you the British Library's website. The British Library is the equivalent of the Library of Congress here in the United States. So this is the primary repository of national documents in Great Britain. And I did a quick search already on George Washington, just used him as an example. What you're seeing right here on your screen is all the collections that the British Library has on George Washington. So we're looking at correspondence, miscellaneous papers. You're looking at various correspondence between British military officers in which George Washington shows up as a topic of conversation. So understand that the presidents have foreign relationships as well, and that those nations themselves are probably keeping that they are probably keeping archives of their own. Now, when you get into developing countries, for example, I did a quick look at Vietnam and what the Vietnamese National Archives or National Museum may hold on, for example, Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon or Dwight Eisenhower or John F. Kennedy, the presidents who were involved in Vietnam. It was not easy to navigate. It is you can get it in English. Often websites will be in foreign languages, but there usually is an English option for you. But none of their collections were online, and they just had brief descriptions of things. So keep in mind that some foreign repositories are going to be of great help to you. Places like the British Library, the Louvre in France, the American Battlefields and Monuments Commission, but those in developing countries might be a little hit or miss. So just go into that with kind of an eye out for that. All right, and I wanted to kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about when I'm suggesting that we can look at the role of the president related to seemingly unpresidential topics. And so the one I chose was the Jackson Purchase. So those of you in West Tennessee especially are familiar with the Jackson Purchase. This happened in the year 1818. This is when Andrew Jackson and Isaac Shelby, for whom Shelby County is named, are going to negotiate the purchase of what today is West Tennessee and Western Kentucky with the Chickasaw Nation. Okay, this is their job. They're trying to acquire all of the land between the Tennessee River and the Mississippi River. Now it's clear how that transaction is going to benefit American settlers, right? That I think that's pretty obvious. The American settlers are looking to move westward. We've got this spirit of manifest destiny that's driving us on. But Andrew Jackson and Isaac Shelby are not acting independently of the direction of the President of the United States. It is the president's job to direct how he wants these people to work. And Andrew Jackson is not president at this time. The president is James Monroe. So James Monroe gives Jackson and Shelby specific directions to acquire the land between the Tennessee and the Mississippi, okay? Some of that fits in the state of Tennessee. Some of it fits in the state of Kentucky. But wherever that land falls, he's defined for them what they are after. Okay, so why is Monroe focused on the Tennessee to the Mississippi, right? What's driving that decision for James Monroe? Jackson has opinions, Shelby has opinions, They have some freedom to act as they wish, but ultimately they're carrying out the wishes of the President of the United States. All right, so can his goals shed some light on the Jackson Purchase? Does it open up for you some more avenues of thought? What does the Monroe Doctrine have to do with this? That's one of those huge issues that comes out of James Monroe's presidency. We use that term today. That term is often used when we look at military action in foreign countries, or getting ourselves involved to sponsor or protect or promote democratic elections in developing countries. So what does the Monroe Doctrine have to do with this? How does that larger goal shape what is driving Jackson in 1818? What are Monroe's views on Native Americans and our relationship with Native nations in that way? What are Monroe's thoughts about the admission of states to the Union? There's a balance to be struck during this time between slave and free states. Where does Monroe come down on that? How does that influence Jackson's actions at the Purchase? What is the idea of manifest destiny? What's the personal relationship between Monroe and Jackson that's going to influence this as well? They have sort of a good one, but if you're ever researching the War of 1812, you'll find this wonderful back channel of communication between James Madison and James Monroe, who don't know what to do with Jackson. They're basically scared of Jackson, and they keep writing each other letters that say things like, "I didn't tell Jackson to do that, did you? I'm not going to be the one to scold him. Why don't you step in and tell him he was wrong?" So it's kind of a funny relationship that is guiding a lot of what is happening in Jackson's and Shelby's decision making. All right, so working with Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, for students, we do quite a little bit of mentoring for History Day projects for students all across the country, not just Tennessee's programs, but for students across the country. If you want to reach out to us to ask us to review a project, to give you some insights on a topic, we are happy to do that at any point, and I've got our contact information down here for you. We also conduct a brief web conferencing program called Ask an Expert. Teachers, that might be something that you want to get the entire class on. So it gives them an opportunity to pose questions to us, not just about Jacksonian topics, but about the process of research at all, ask us to weigh in on some resources. We're happy to do that. For teachers, we do offer virtual field trips. We offer curriculum planning, assistance, teacher development. So we're always here to support your work with Tennessee History Day for sure. I've got our contact information here at the bottom. Please feel free to reach out and use that at any time, and we will do everything we can to be of help.